The story begins long before courtrooms, headlines, or whispered betrayals. It starts in a world that on the surface looked ordinary. Narrow city blocks stretched beneath dim streetlights. Storefront windows reflected the slow rhythm of everyday life. Families walked home after long shifts. Children played until their mothers called them inside. Nothing about these streets suggested that one day they would be linked to one of the most infamous figures in organized crime history. Sammy Gravano grew up in an environment shaped by survival, loyalty, and silence. The neighborhood had rules that were never written down, yet everyone understood them. Respect mattered more than comfort, strength mattered more than fairness, and reputation could follow a person for life. For a young boy trying to find his place, these invisible laws felt as real as concrete beneath his shoes. School offered little refuge. Classrooms demanded patience and focus, but the streets rewarded toughness and quick decisions. Teachers saw distraction. The neighborhood saw potential. The difference between those two perspectives would quietly shape the direction of a life that had not yet revealed its future. In communities where opportunity feels distant, identity often forms around the people closest by. Older boys became examples, local figures became legends. Stories passed between corners and storefronts carried more weight than distant promises of success through education or slow, lawful work. To a young mind searching for belonging, power looked attractive, even when it came wrapped in danger. Nothing about this path felt dramatic at first. There was no single moment where everything changed. Instead, small choices stacked together like bricks, forming a road that slowly turned away from ordinary life. Time spent on certain corners, friendships built on shared defiance. A growing comfort with bending rules that once felt firm. Each step seemed minor, but together they created momentum. The culture surrounding organized crime did not always appear violent from the outside. It often looked structured, disciplined, even honorable in a distorted way. Words like loyalty and family were used frequently. Conflict was hidden behind quiet conversations. Power moved silently. For someone young, this hidden world could seem less like crime and more like belonging. Yet beneath that surface lived consequences most people never saw until it was too late. Fear traveled quietly through the same streets where laughter echoed. Decisions made in seconds could shape decades. Trust could disappear overnight. And the idea of control was often an illusion. As Gravano moved deeper into adolescence, the distance between two possible futures began to widen. One path required patience, humility, and time. The other offered fast recognition, immediate respect, and the illusion of certainty. For many young men in similar environments, that second path felt easier to understand. It provided identity before maturity had fully formed. Violence did not arrive loudly. It entered gradually, disguised as necessity. Arguments escalated faster. Reputation demanded defense. Small conflicts carried heavier meaning. Over time, reacting with force stopped feeling shocking and started feeling normal. This quiet shift more than any single event marked the true turning point. The psychology of organized crime often begins here, in normalization. When extreme behavior becomes routine, moral boundaries blur. Actions once considered unthinkable become justified through loyalty, pressure, or fear. Individuals stop seeing themselves as choosing darkness. Instead, they believe they are simply surviving within the only system available to them. For Gravano, recognition within this underground culture brought a sense of validation missing elsewhere. Approval came not from grades or lawful achievement, but from toughness and reliability. The more he proved himself in that world, the further ordinary life faded into the background. Each new connection strengthened the pull. Still, nothing in those early years guaranteed the future that history would later record. Many young men walked similar streets and chose different endings. Some stepped away. Some never entered at all. The difference often came down to moments so small they seemed meaningless at the time: who someone trusted, who offered guidance, who remained silent, and who spoke up. Organized crime thrives in silence. It grows where fear prevents honesty and where loyalty is measured by secrecy rather than truth. Communities affected by it often carry invisible weight for generations. Businesses struggle. Families worry. Opportunities shrink. The damage spreads far beyond the individuals directly involved. From a distance, crime stories can appear dramatic, even glamorous. Films and television sometimes highlight power while softening consequences, but real life tells a harsher truth. Every rise built on violence carries an inevitable fall. Every shortcut demands a price. and every illusion of control eventually meets reality. Understanding this beginning matters because it reveals something deeper than one person's choices. It shows how environment, influence, and identity can quietly guide a life toward danger long before headlines appear. It reminds us that prevention starts early with support, education, and visible alternatives strong enough to compete with the pull of the streets. As the years moved forward, the world around Gravano continued to change. Opportunities to step deeper into organized crime became more visible. Expectations grew heavier. The line between observer and participant slowly disappeared. What once felt distant now stood directly in front of him, waiting for a decision that would shape everything that followed. History would later remember the outcomes, trials, testimonies, and the collapse of powerful criminal networks. But at this stage, none of that existed yet. There was only a young man, a neighborhood filled with unspoken rules, and a future still unwritten. And in that quiet space before notoriety, one truth remained clear. The choices made in ordinary moments often create extraordinary consequences. The deeper lesson hidden inside this beginning is not about crime itself, but about direction. Every environment presents pressure. Every life presents crossroads. But the power to choose differently, though difficult, always exists. Recognizing that power early can change everything. Because the real story is not how someone enters darkness. The real story is what that darkness ultimately costs. The movement from childhood uncertainty into adult identity rarely happens all at once. It unfolds quietly, shaped by pressure, expectation, and the desire to belong somewhere that feels certain. For Sammy Gravano, the transition did not arrive with celebration or clarity. It emerged through tension between what life could have been and what it was slowly becoming. As the years passed, the neighborhood that once felt ordinary began to reveal sharper edges. Conversations carried hidden meanings. Glances lasted longer. Respect was no longer just a word adults used. It became a currency traded daily. In this environment, a young man learned quickly that how others saw him could determine how safely he moved through the world. Opportunities connected to legitimate work still existed, but they demanded patience and discipline that felt distant from the immediate rewards offered elsewhere. Small tasks for the wrong people brought quick cash and faster recognition. Each successful errand built trust. Each display of toughness strengthened reputation. Gradually, the idea of stepping back became harder to imagine. Reputation in the criminal underworld does not grow through kindness or education. It forms through risk. People watch closely, measuring reliability in silence. They look for hesitation, fear, or weakness. When none appears, doors begin to open. What seems like acceptance is often something far more dangerous, an invitation into a system that rarely allows exit. Gravano's presence within the system expanded piece by piece. He learned how conversations changed when certain names were mentioned. He noticed how conflicts disappeared after private meetings. He saw how power operated without needing to raise its voice. These lessons were not taught in classrooms, yet they shaped behavior more strongly than any formal instruction. Violence, when it appeared, was rarely chaotic. It followed rules understood only by those inside the circle. Actions carried messages. Silence carried warnings. Every decision served a purpose tied to control, territory, or loyalty. For someone seeking identity, this structure could feel almost professional, an organized world hidden beneath the surface of everyday life. Still, fear traveled alongside respect. Even those who appeared confident understood the fragility of their position. Trust could shift overnight. Alliances could dissolve without explanation. A single mistake could erase years of loyalty. Living inside that uncertainty required constant awareness, a mental state that slowly reshaped how a person viewed the world. The deeper Gravano moved into this environment, the more distant ordinary life became. Relationships outside the criminal circle weakened. Conversations with family grew shorter, less honest. Explaining daily choices would have required truths too complicated or too dangerous to share. Silence became easier than confession. Money arrived more quickly now, but it carried weight. Every dollar connected him further to expectations he could not easily escape. Financial gain created comfort, yet it also created obligation. In organized crime, nothing is truly free. Every favor eventually returns as a demand. At the same time, recognition from powerful figures brought a sense of validation stronger than anything he had known before. Approval from respected names in the underworld felt like achievement. Praise replaced doubt. Confidence replaced hesitation. But beneath that confidence lived a reality few acknowledged openly. The higher someone rises in a criminal hierarchy, the more visible and vulnerable they become. Law enforcement pressure existed in the background, constant but distant enough to ignore. Arrests happened to others. Investigations targeted different names. This distance created illusion. It allowed participants to believe consequences might never reach them. History shows how often that belief proves wrong. Psychologically, involvement in organized crime reshapes moral reasoning. Actions once considered unacceptable become justified as necessary. Harm becomes strategy. Loyalty becomes excuse. Over time, the line between right and wrong fades into something harder to define. Survival replaces conscience as the guiding force. Yet even within this world, moments of reflection still surfaced. Quiet nights brought questions daylight could suppress. Thoughts about family, future, and permanence drifted in unexpectedly, but reflection without change rarely alters direction. By the time doubt appears, momentum often feels too strong to stop. Gravano's reputation continued to grow not loudly, but steadily. He was seen as dependable, willing to act, and capable of remaining calm under pressure. These qualities carried value in a system built on control. They also carried danger, because usefulness in organized crime often leads to deeper involvement rather than freedom. The transformation from participant to committed insider rarely feels dramatic while it is happening. It feels practical, logical, even inevitable. Only later, when consequences unfold, does the full weight of those choices become visible. By then, reversing course is far more difficult. Communities touched by organized crime experience this process differently. From the outside, changes appear subtle: new cars, closed-door meetings, businesses that seem successful without clear explanation. But underneath, tension grows. Fear settles quietly. People learn what not to ask. Silence spreads wider than truth. Understanding the stage of the story reveals how crime sustains itself across generations. It is not built only on violence, but on gradual acceptance. Each new recruit believes he is choosing strength, when in reality he is surrendering freedom piece by piece. The system survives because it convinces individuals they are gaining control. For Gravano, the path forward now felt clearer than any alternative. Turning back would have meant losing respect, income, and identity all at once. Continuing forward promised influence and protection, at least on the surface. Between those two options, the second seemed easier to accept. But history teaches a consistent lesson. Paths built on fear rarely lead to stability. They lead instead to escalating risk, deeper secrecy, and consequences that eventually reach everyone involved. The timeline may vary, but the outcome rarely changes. At this point in the journey, nothing dramatic had yet exposed the future. There were no national headlines, no courtroom testimonies, no public revelations, only quiet movement toward a destiny still hidden from view. The most important decisions were being made in ordinary moments, unnoticed by the world. And that is what makes this stage so powerful. It shows how lives rarely collapse overnight. They drift, slowly and silently, toward outcomes shaped by thousands of small choices. Each step feels manageable. Together, they become irreversible. The lesson within this chapter is not simply about one man's growing reputation. It is about awareness. It is about recognizing how environments influence direction, and how easily temporary rewards can disguise permanent consequences. Most importantly, it is about understanding that true strength is not proven through fear or control, but through the courage to choose a different path, even when that choice feels lonely. Because in the end, reputation built on intimidation fades, but character built on integrity endures. By the time adulthood settles in, most people begin to understand the long-term direction of their lives. Some follow predictable roads shaped by education, steady work, and family tradition. Others move through uncertainty, searching for stability wherever it can be found. For Sammy Gravano, that search had already guided him close to a hidden structure of power operating beneath the surface of ordinary society. What remained was the final step from association into full commitment. Nothing about that step felt ceremonial. There were no bright lights or public announcements. Instead, the transition happened in quiet rooms, private conversations, and unspoken expectations. Organized crime rarely reveals itself dramatically. It prefers silence, patience, and gradual control. By the time someone realizes how deep they have entered, leaving is no longer simple. Inside this world, hierarchy governed everything. Authority flowed downward through relationships built on loyalty and proven obedience. Each position carried responsibility, but also risk. Advancement meant trust from powerful figures, yet it also meant greater exposure to danger from rivals, from betrayal, and from law enforcement slowly tightening its focus. Gravano's growing reputation for reliability placed him closer to the center of this structure. He was no longer just present, he was becoming necessary. In organized crime, usefulness is often mistaken for security. The more dependable a person becomes, the more the system depends on him, and the harder it becomes for him to imagine life outside it. Daily routines began to change. Meetings replaced casual conversations. Decisions carried heavier consequences. Every action required awareness of how it might affect not just one individual but an entire network. Living under that constant pressure demanded emotional distance. Compassion, hesitation, and doubt could be interpreted as weakness. Over time, suppressing those feelings became second nature. Violence, once shocking, now appeared calculated. It was discussed in terms of strategy rather than emotion. Harm became a tool for maintaining order, enforcing loyalty, or protecting reputation. This transformation illustrates one of the most dangerous psychological shifts within criminal organizations. When morality is replaced by efficiency, almost any action can be justified. Yet even in such an environment, fear never disappears. It simply changes form. Early fears of physical confrontation evolve into deeper anxieties, surveillance, informants, internal conflict, or sudden loss of status. Power within organized crime is never permanent. It must be defended constantly, often against threats that remain invisible until it is too late. Gravano learned quickly that silence carried value equal to action. Knowing when not to speak, when not to react, and when to wait patiently could determine survival. Words spoken carelessly in the wrong place might travel farther than intended. Trust, once broken, could never fully return. In this way, communication inside the underworld followed rules far stricter than those in ordinary life. At the same time, the rewards continued to reinforce commitment. Financial gain brought comfort that had once seemed unreachable. Recognition from influential figures created a sense of belonging stronger than anything outside the organization. Success appeared tangible, immediate, and undeniable. Compared to the slow progress of lawful careers, this world seemed to offer certainty. But certainty built on secrecy is fragile. Every hidden system carries internal tension. Rivalries form quietly. Ambition grows behind polite gestures. Alliances shift without warning. The same structure that provides protection can quickly become a source of danger. Those who rise high enough eventually see how unstable the foundation truly is. Family life often becomes the silent casualty of this transformation. Maintaining emotional closeness while living a concealed existence proves nearly impossible. Conversations remain shallow. Truth stays hidden. Loved ones sense distance without understanding its cause. Over time, separation grows not always physically, but emotionally, in ways that are harder to repair. Law enforcement presence, though rarely visible day to day, continued advancing in the background. Investigators studied patterns, relationships, and financial movements with patience equal to that of the criminal networks they pursued. Cases built slowly, sometimes over years, waiting for the moment when evidence would finally reveal the full picture. This quiet persistence often goes unnoticed by those who believe secrecy guarantees safety. Within Gravano's world, loyalty remained the highest spoken value. It was praised, demanded, and expected without question. Yet history shows that loyalty inside criminal organizations is often conditional. It survives only as long as power remains stable. When pressure increases through arrests, investigations, or internal conflict, loyalty can fracture faster than anyone expects. Still, at this stage, the future consequences remain distant. Daily life focused on immediate responsibilities, not long-term outcomes. Momentum carried everything forward. Each successful decision strengthened confidence. Each avoided danger reinforced belief in control. The illusion of permanence grew stronger. Psychologically, this phase represents full immersion. Identity becomes inseparable from the organization. Personal goals merge with group survival. The individual begins to measure worth not by inner values, but by external reputation. Escaping such a mindset requires more than physical distance. It requires rebuilding an entire sense of self. Communities surrounding organized crime rarely witness these internal transformations directly. They see only fragments, rumors, sudden wealth, unexplained influence. Yet the deeper cost remains hidden, lives shaped by constant vigilance, relationships strained by secrecy, and futures limited by choices that cannot easily be undone. For Gravano, standing fully inside this shadow world likely felt less dramatic than outsiders might imagine. It felt structured, purposeful, even logical. Human beings adapt quickly to their environments, no matter how dangerous those environments may be. What once seemed extreme can eventually feel routine. But beneath routine lies consequence, waiting patiently. Organized crime history follows a familiar pattern: rise, consolidation of power, internal conflict, and eventual collapse under legal or personal pressure. Few escape this cycle unchanged. Many never escape at all. Understanding this moment in the story matters because it highlights the true turning point. Not the first mistake, not the first risk, but the moment when leaving becomes hardest. Prevention is simplest before this stage. Afterward, every step forward tightens the grip. The broader lesson extends beyond crime itself. Any path built on secrecy, fear, or moral compromise eventually demands payment. Success gained quickly often disappears just as quickly. An identity built on external approval rarely survives hardship. Real strength appears different. It grows slowly through honesty, responsibility, and patience. It may lack the excitement of rapid power, but it offers something far more valuable: stability that cannot be taken away overnight. As Gravano continued moving deeper into the machinery of organized crime, the world outside kept turning, unaware of how close hidden forces were to public revelation. The quiet streets of his youth felt far away now, replaced by decisions carrying irreversible weight. And still, the most important truth remained unseen. Every shadow, no matter how dark, eventually meets the light. As time moved forward, the hidden world surrounded Sammy Gravano no longer felt distant or mysterious. It had become structured, familiar, and deeply woven into daily existence. What once appeared as opportunity now carried responsibility. What once felt like excitement now demanded constant awareness. The transformation from participant to trusted insider had quietly taken hold, and with that transformation came a new reality. Power was never free. It always arrived alongside pressure. Inside organized crime, advancement is rarely celebrated openly. Recognition comes in subtle forms: invitations to more private meetings, access to higher-level conversations, and responsibilities that signal trust without ever needing to be spoken aloud. These moments may appear small, but within the underworld they represent significant movement. They mean someone is being watched closely, measured carefully, and considered important enough to carry risk. For Gravano, this stage likely felt like validation of every difficult choice made along the way. The neighborhood struggles of youth, the years spent proving reliability, the willingness to follow orders without hesitation, all of it now seemed to lead somewhere meaningful. In environments where respect defines identity, rising status can feel like success in its purest form. Yet the higher someone rises in a criminal hierarchy, the narrower life becomes. Freedom shrinks. Privacy disappears. Every action must align with expectations set by powerful figures above. Independent thinking, once useful, becomes dangerous if it challenges authority. Even friendships grow complicated, because trust must always compete with survival. Pressure within this world operates quietly but relentlessly. There are no scheduled breaks from vigilance, no safe spaces where truth can be spoken freely. Even moments of calm carry tension beneath the surface, because uncertainty is permanent. A single misunderstanding, a rumor, or an unexpected investigation can shift everything overnight. Money continues to flow more easily at this level, reinforcing the illusion that risk is worthwhile. Comfort increases. Material success becomes visible. To outsiders, such success may look inviolable, even glamorous. But comfort built on instability cannot provide real peace. The fear of losing everything remains constant, often stronger than the satisfaction of having gained it. Psychologically, this stage deepens emotional separation from ordinary life. Conversations with people outside the criminal world begin to feel distant, almost unreal. Their concerns appear small compared to the high-stakes decisions happening in secret rooms. This growing divide strengthens commitment to the organization while weakening connection to healthier influences. Violence, whether carried out directly or ordered indirectly, now becomes tied to maintaining structure. It is framed not as anger, but as necessity. Language shifts to justify harm. Words like protection, discipline, or business replace the reality of human consequence. Such language allows individuals to act without confronting the moral weight of their decisions. But moral weight never truly disappears. It settles quietly beneath the surface, emerging in unexpected ways: restlessness, distrust, or the inability to feel genuine calm. Even those who appear confident often carry invisible stress. Living with constant risk reshapes the nervous system, keeping the mind prepared for danger, even during silence. Law enforcement pressure, though still distant in daily routine, continues building with patience. Investigators understand that organized crime rarely collapses quickly. They gather fragments of truth over time, connecting relationships, finances, and behavior patterns into a larger picture. This slow process contrasts sharply with the fast pace of criminal decision-making, yet history shows which approach ultimately prevails. Within Gravano's environment, loyalty remains the most repeated word. It is presented as sacred, unquestionable, absolute. But loyalty enforced through fear differs greatly from loyalty chosen through respect. When survival becomes the main motivation, promises lose stability. Under enough pressure, even the strongest alliances can fracture. At the same time, internal competition grows more intense as individuals seek influence and security. Ambition, once hidden, begins shaping decisions. Small disagreements carry larger implications. Power balances shift subtly, sometimes without anyone noticing until consequences appear. Organized crime often falls not only because of outside forces, but because of internal tension that slowly weakens unity. Family relationships continue feeling the strain of secrecy. Providing financially may create the appearance of stability, yet emotional distance expands. Loved ones may sense unease without understanding its cause. Important moments pass without full presence. Over time, the cost of hidden life becomes impossible to ignore, even if it remains unspoken. Despite these pressures, the illusion of control remains strong. Success reinforces belief in personal invincibility. Avoiding consequences creates confidence that consequences may never come. This mindset represents one of the most dangerous turning points in criminal psychology, the belief that rules applying to others no longer apply to oneself. History repeatedly disproves this belief. No criminal structure, no matter how disciplined or powerful, escapes eventual exposure. Investigations intensify. Trust erodes. Mistakes accumulate. The same system that once provided protection becomes fragile under scrutiny. Collapse rarely happens suddenly. It unfolds through a chain of events that feel manageable until they are no longer reversible. For Gravano, standing at this level of influence meant living between two realities. One reality offered status, money, and recognition. The other carried risk, secrecy, and inevitable consequence. Holding both realities at once required constant mental balance, a balance that grows harder to maintain over time. Communities surrounding organized crime continue absorbing quiet damage. Businesses face pressure. Opportunities disappear. Fear limits honest conversation. Even those not directly involved feel the weight of hidden power shaping everyday life. Crime rarely affects only its participants. It spreads harm outward in widening circles. Understanding this stage of the story reveals an essential truth. Power gained through fear is never stable. It must be defended continuously, often at increasing cost. True stability comes only from systems built on law, trust, and accountability principles absent inside organized crime. The deeper lesson extends beyond one individual's journey. Many people in different environments face temptations promising fast success or instant recognition. The details may differ, but the underlying choice remains the same. Pursue short-term power or long-term integrity. Only one of those paths leads to lasting peace. As Gravano continued moving forward, the tension between illusion and reality grew stronger. The structure around him appeared solid, yet invisible cracks had already begun forming. Pressure from outside forces was slowly approaching. Internal dynamics were quietly shifting. The future, though unseen, was already in motion, and when illusion finally meets truth, the outcome is never gentle. Because control built on secrecy does not fade slowly. It breaks suddenly, completely, and without warning. Time inside the hidden structure of organized crime does not pass in ordinary ways. Days are measured less by calendars and more by tension, expectation, and the quiet movement of power. For Sammy Gravano, life had reached a point where the system around him no longer felt temporary. It felt permanent, almost inevitable, as if the path behind him had disappeared and only forward motion remained possible. Loyalty stood at the center of everything. It was spoken about with reverence, repeated in conversations, and reinforced through action. Within this world, loyalty was not just a value, it was a requirement for survival. To question authority, to hesitate in responsibility, or to reveal weakness could carry consequences far beyond personal disappointment. The rules were clear, even when they were never written down. Yet loyalty inside organized crime carries a hidden contradiction. It demands absolute commitment from individuals while offering no absolute protection in return. Alliances depend on power, and power shifts. Trust depends on silence, and silence can hide betrayal. The very principle meant to create unity often becomes the source of deepest vulnerability. As Gravano's role continued to solidify, expectations surrounding him grew heavier. Responsibility meant involvement in decisions that shaped not only individual outcomes, but the stability of an entire network. Every action required careful thought, not just about immediate results, but about long-term perception. Reputation had become both shield and burden. Silence played an equally powerful role. In ordinary society, silence may simply mean privacy. In organized crime, silence becomes a form of currency. Information is controlled, shared selectively, and protected fiercely. Words spoken in the wrong place can travel faster than intention, creating danger where none existed before. Learning when not to speak becomes as important as knowing what to do. Living within such constant restraint reshapes the mind. Conversations grow guarded. Emotions remain hidden. Even moments of personal reflection may feel risky, as if acknowledging doubt could somehow weaken resolve. Over time, this emotional compression creates distance between the individual and his own sense of identity. Financial success continued reinforcing the belief that the chosen path had been worthwhile. Comfort, security, and visible achievement created an image of control that outsiders might admire, without understanding its cost. Yet material gain cannot quiet internal tension. The more someone has to lose, the stronger fear becomes. Fear at this level rarely appears dramatic. It does not always arrive through obvious threats or visible danger. Instead, it exists as constant awareness, the sense that stability depends on forces beyond personal control. A single investigation, a single betrayal, or a single mistake could unravel everything built over years. Living with that knowledge changes how a person sees the future. Relationships outside the criminal world continued fading into distance. Honest communication felt impossible without revealing truths that could not safely be shared. Loved ones might see success, but they could not see the pressure behind it. This separation often creates loneliness, even when surrounded by people. Connection without honesty can never feel complete. Inside the organization, unity appeared strong on the surface. Conversations emphasized brotherhood, mutual protection, and shared purpose. Yet beneath that surface, human nature remained unchanged. Ambition, jealousy, and fear moved quietly through the same rooms where loyalty was praised. The stronger the pressure from outside forces, the more fragile internal unity could become. Law enforcement efforts, though still operating mostly out of sight, continued advancing with patience. Investigators understood that silence within criminal organizations eventually creates cracks. Pressure applied slowly can reveal truths that force alone cannot uncover. History had shown this pattern many times, even if those inside the system believed themselves different. For Gravano, standing firmly within this world required constant justification both outwardly and internally. Actions had to make sense within the logic of survival. Doubt had to remain suppressed. Looking too closely at moral consequence could weaken the ability to function. This psychological balancing act represents one of the heaviest burdens carried by those deeply involved in organized crime. Communities affected by such systems often experience quiet suffering. Businesses operate under pressure. Opportunities disappear before they can grow. Families live with unspoken fear. Even those untouched directly feel the presence of something hidden shaping daily life. Crime's damage spreads far beyond visible headlines. Despite everything, the illusion of permanence still held strong. Years had passed without collapse. Success continued. Authority remained intact. It became easier to believe that the system might endure indefinitely. This belief, though comforting, ignored the lessons written throughout history. No structure built on secrecy and fear survives forever. Psychologically, this stage reflects entrapment more than empowerment. What once felt like choice now feels like obligation. Freedom narrows until alternatives seem impossible. The very system that promised control becomes the force removing it. Recognizing this truth often arrives too late to change direction easily. Moments of quiet reflection may still have surfaced, especially during rare pauses from constant movement. Questions about future, legacy, and consequence sometimes emerge when distraction fades. But reflection without action cannot alter destiny. Awareness alone does not create escape. The deeper lesson within this chapter extends beyond one individual story. Many forms of destructive behavior rely on the same foundations: silence, misplaced loyalty, and gradual moral compromise. Whether in crime, corruption, or personal choices, the pattern remains consistent. Short-term security hides long-term cost. True loyalty, in contrast, does not demand silence in the face of harm. It protects truth rather than secrecy. It strengthens lives rather than controlling them. Understanding this difference can change the direction of an entire future. As Gravano continued forward, the tension between loyalty and survival grew stronger, though its full impact had not yet appeared. Forces beyond his control were slowly aligning. Pressure from outside the organization was building. Internal stability was less certain than it seemed. The future waited quietly, preparing to reveal consequences that silence could not prevent. Because silence may delay truth, but it can never erase it, and when truth finally speaks, it changes everything. By the time Sammy Gravano had solidified his place within the organization, the environment around him had become both familiar and dangerous, in ways impossible to ignore. Influence, power, and respect had grown alongside responsibility, yet each came with risks carefully disguised as opportunity. The closer he moved toward the center of authority, the clearer it became that no success in this world could ever exist without exposure to danger. Power inside organized crime is not like power in ordinary society. It does not bring security, it magnifies vulnerability. Every decision becomes public, at least to those who matter. Every action carries weight beyond immediate consequence, and every misstep, however minor, can ripple through the network in ways that the most careful planning cannot anticipate. Gravano had learned early that influence was earned, not given. It was measured through consistency, courage, and reliability. Those who displayed hesitation, indecision, or self-interest too openly rarely advanced. For those who proved themselves dependable, opportunity appeared, but opportunity in this world is never neutral. It always comes attached to risk. Daily life became a delicate balance of visible authority and hidden pressure. On the surface, interactions appeared routine: meetings, discussions, arrangements. Yet beneath the surface, every conversation carried potential consequences. A wrong word could undermine trust. A delay in decision-making could signal weakness. The eyes of those above and beside Gravano observed every nuance, calculating where allegiance lay. Even financial gain was fraught with complication. Success could attract admiration, but it also drew attention from rivals, law enforcement, and internal skeptics. Wealth in this context is less about comfort than leverage. It creates visibility, which is both a shield and a target. The higher the influence, the more individuals feel pressure from multiple directions simultaneously. Violence continued to operate as a strategic instrument. Decisions regarding enforcement, retaliation, or demonstration of authority were no longer impulsive, they were calculated. Gravano saw firsthand that harm could be deployed to preserve structure, influence decisions, and maintain control. Each action sent messages louder than words, yet it also reinforced the personal weight of responsibility for every outcome. Psychologically, living under constant scrutiny reshapes perception. Every relationship becomes filtered through the lens of trust, loyalty, and potential risk. Every action is evaluated for its effect on personal status and the stability of the organization. Ordinary human instincts, empathy, spontaneity, and casual honesty must be suppressed or reframed to fit the environment. Over time, this cognitive restructuring can alter a person's ability to relate outside the system entirely. Law enforcement continued its patient pursuit in the background. Cases were constructed slowly, relying on observation, financial tracking, and deep investigation rather than immediate confrontation. Investigators understood that organized crime moves with caution, but also that pressure applied consistently exposes cracks in even the most disciplined structures. What appears permanent in the moment is often fragile under slow scrutiny. As Gravano rose in influence, he observed the double-edged nature of authority. Influence allowed him to direct actions, protect associates, and consolidate power. Yet it also created dependence. The higher he moved, the more the system relied on him, and the less freedom he truly possessed. Every choice was scrutinized, every mistake magnified, and every loyalty tested. Internal dynamics within the organization became more pronounced at this stage. Competition for favor, position, and recognition intensified quietly. Small disagreements evolved into significant tension. Ambition began subtly shifting alliances. Trust, once assumed, now required ongoing proof. The balance between maintaining authority and avoiding internal conflict became a daily exercise in strategy. Family and personal relationships continued to feel the strain. Maintaining proximity while protecting secrecy proved impossible. Loved ones could sense tension, confusion, and distance, yet they could not fully understand the reasons behind it. Emotional isolation grew, creating subtle but persistent pressure that compounded the stress of professional obligation. Everyday decisions carried far-reaching implications. Choosing whom to trust, when to speak, and which paths to follow required constant evaluation. One misjudgment could undo years of progress. One poorly timed action could spark conflict with irreversible consequences. Gravano was learning the relentless nature of decision-making at the top of an intricate and dangerous hierarchy. Yet, despite the stress and danger, the illusion of control persisted. It is a psychological anchor in situations where stakes are high. Believing in personal invincibility allows function under extreme conditions, even though history shows that no such invincibility exists. This belief is both necessary for operational efficiency and a precursor to eventual vulnerability. Communities surrounding organized crime continued to absorb the indirect impact of Gravano's world. Fear, silence, and financial pressure spread beyond direct participants. Opportunities for legitimate growth diminished. Social cohesion suffered. The costs of influence extend far beyond immediate participants, creating subtle but profound social consequences. The broader lesson of this stage is crucial. Power gained at the expense of ethical boundaries and personal integrity carries inherent risk. Influence is never neutral in high-stakes environments. It amplifies responsibility, exposes vulnerability, and tightens the grip of unseen forces. Only understanding and respecting these realities allows someone to navigate such a system with any hope of survival, though escape is often difficult once fully embedded. This period of Gravano's life illustrates a principle that applies across contexts. The closer one becomes to concentrated power gained through compromise, the higher the personal stakes. Opportunity and danger are inseparable. Success comes at the cost of freedom, and influence carries a burden invisible to outsiders. The deeper educational takeaway is clear. The allure of immediate success, fast recognition, or unchecked authority may feel rewarding, but it is always accompanied by hidden costs. Long-term stability, true leadership, and enduring respect come from sustainable choices built on integrity, transparency, and accountability, qualities often absent in criminal networks but essential in all areas of life. For Gravano, the weight of influence and the cost of silence were constant companions. Every day he operated in a system where failure could ripple through multiple lives. Every decision held consequences that extended far beyond his own perspective. And yet, at the same time, the structure provided identity, status, and purpose, a complex paradox that illustrates the seductive danger of organized crime. As events unfolded, the pressures that had been invisible began to manifest in subtle signs of instability, rivalries, internal tension, and law enforcement scrutiny, all growing quietly, waiting for the right moment to intersect. The closer someone moves to the center of hidden power, the more they discover that no structure, no matter how disciplined, exists without fragility. Because influence without accountability is never truly power. It is a weight that eventually becomes impossible to bear. At this stage of Sammy Gravano's life, the distinction between survival and ambition had become nearly invisible. The choices he faced no longer felt like simple matters of right and wrong. They were matters of control, loyalty, and long-term positioning. Every decision carried weight not only for himself but for the network of people who depended on him, and who in turn could harm him if he faltered. The world he inhabited was no longer about opportunity. It was about strategy, consequence, and the high cost of crossing invisible lines. The line between legal and illegal behavior, once clear in theory, had become blurred in practice. Gravano understood that minor transgressions led to larger entanglements. Small compromises, once justified as necessary for survival or protection, paved the way for increasingly serious acts. Decisions that might have once seemed shocking now appeared practical, and practicality in his world was measured less by morality and more by efficiency, loyalty, and results. In this environment, influence carried both benefit and danger. His reputation for reliability and courage elevated him in the eyes of the hierarchy, opening doors that many could only imagine. Yet, that same reputation drew attention from law enforcement competitors and even allies with their own ambitions. Every assignment, every meeting, and every interaction had the potential to escalate into a matter of life or death. Mistakes were magnified, intentional or not, and every action contributed to a growing record of behavior that could not be undone. Violence remained a tool, a calculated, deliberate instrument used to enforce loyalty, protect interests, or resolve conflicts. Gravano observed that those who avoided it risked losing credibility, while those who misused it risked legal or internal retaliation. Violence was rarely impulsive. It followed a structure governed by unspoken rules. Understanding these rules became essential for survival, yet even adherence to them did not remove the moral burden of responsibility. Every action taken had real human consequences. As power and responsibility increased, so too did the isolation. Relationships outside the organization grew tenuous. Friends and family noticed changes, distance, secrecy, and subtle tension. Gravano's ability to relate normally to people outside the criminal network diminished, replaced by a constant need to assess, predict, and calculate risk. Emotional intelligence was repurposed for survival, not connection. Human interactions were increasingly viewed through a lens of suspicion, utility, or threat assessment. This phase of life also highlighted the precarious nature of loyalty. Within organized crime, loyalty is presented as absolute, yet in reality, it is conditional. Alliances shift with power. Pressure and fear can override affection or shared history. Gravano observed colleagues navigating these shifting dynamics, where yesterday's trusted ally could become today's competitor. Survival required constant attention to subtle shifts in behavior, tone, and alliances. A single misjudgment could carry irreversible consequences. Financial success continued to reinforce the illusion of control. Money offered comfort and influence, masking the growing fragility of the life he had constructed. It provided tangible proof of accomplishment, yet every dollar earned came with strings attached, expectations, obligations, and exposure. Financial gain in organized crime is never a measure of freedom. It is a measure of dependence, a reminder that every opportunity carries risk. The psychological toll of this period cannot be understated. Decision-making under constant pressure changes perception. Fear, stress, and the necessity for deception affect judgment. Moral reasoning becomes a tool rather than a guide. Survival required suppression of natural instincts toward honesty, empathy, and self-preservation in favor of efficiency, loyalty, and protection of reputation. Over time, these adaptations shape the individual profoundly, leaving lasting consequences even after leaving the environment. Law enforcement continued to operate in the background with patience that matched the meticulous nature of the criminal networks themselves. Investigators observed patterns, relationships, and financial movements. Their strategy relied on slow accumulation of evidence rather than immediate confrontation. Gravano, like many in his position, may have felt untouchable at times, but the reality was that the web of accountability outside his control was steadily growing. Silence could protect him temporarily, but eventual exposure was inevitable. Internal tension also increased as Gravano moved higher in the hierarchy. Ambition, jealousy, and rivalry grew quietly, often hidden behind politeness or deference. Decisions once purely strategic now had emotional undercurrents. Misplaced trust or misread intentions could spark conflict that reverberated far beyond the individuals involved. Navigating this subtle landscape required constant attention, keen observation, and a sense of intuition honed under pressure. Family relationships continued to strain under the weight of secrecy. Providing financially could not offset the absence of presence, honesty, or emotional availability. Loved ones might witness material comfort, but they could not see the constant vigilance, internal calculation, and moral compromise shaping Gravano's life. Emotional distance, though invisible, created subtle but lasting consequences that affect both the individual and those around him. The most dangerous lesson of this stage is that crossing moral lines, even gradually, creates momentum. What begins as a justified compromise can escalate into habitual behavior. Each act reinforces a pattern, and each pattern shapes identity. Gravano's story demonstrates how the combination of ambition, opportunity, and suppressed moral boundaries creates an environment where the next necessary decision always demands more than the last. The broader educational takeaway is clear. Choices made under pressure, particularly those justified by loyalty or ambition, have long-term consequences that far exceed immediate results. In any system, criminal, corporate, or personal, the principle remains. Ethical compromises may appear practical in the short term but accumulate into irreversible outcomes. Understanding this dynamic is essential for anyone navigating high-pressure environments. By the time Gravano fully embraced his responsibilities, he had become a central figure in the system, capable of directing action and influence, but also increasingly trapped by it. Every decision, every assignment, and every conversation carried weight far beyond what he had experienced in earlier years. Survival required constant vigilance, emotional discipline, and moral negotiation. Each success reinforced the illusion of invincibility, masking the reality that exposure and collapse were always looming. This stage illustrates a critical paradox. The higher one rises within a secretive, high-stakes system, the more power they hold, and the less freedom they truly possess. Influence, recognition, and financial gain cannot compensate for the constant psychological and emotional burden of responsibility. Every action becomes part of a larger chain where mistakes, misjudgments, or unanticipated consequences carry amplified significance. The lesson embedded in this chapter extends beyond crime itself. Every high-pressure environment, whether legal or illicit, contains hidden costs for choice made without foresight, integrity, or consideration of long-term impact. Immediate gains may obscure systemic risks, and success achieved at the expense of moral boundaries rarely lasts without consequence. The distinction between practical short-term advantage and sustainable long-term stability becomes the defining factor in the ultimate outcome of any life or organization. For Gravano, life at this stage was a continuous negotiation between ambition, survival, and consequence. Every decision shaped future opportunities and potential threats. Every act of loyalty came with unspoken obligations. Every moment of silence carried weight equal to spoken words, and the deeper truth remained. The system that provided status and protection also contained the seeds of eventual collapse. Because every choice made in the shadows eventually reaches the light, and every line crossed leaves an indelible mark on the path forward. By the time Sammy Gravano had established himself as a key figure within the organization, the delicate balance of power, loyalty, and survival had become both his greatest asset and his most significant burden. Trust, once assumed, was no longer simple. Every alliance was tested, every word weighed, and every action scrutinized. In the shadow world he navigated, trust could not be earned casually, and betrayal was rarely obvious until it was too late. Loyalty, a core principle of organized crime, carried dual meaning. It promised protection, recognition, and inclusion within the network, yet it also demanded complete compliance. Questioning authority, hesitating in decisions, or acting independently could be seen as a threat. The paradox was that loyalty created security while simultaneously restricting freedom. Gravano had learned to walk this tightrope, understanding that one misstep could undo years of carefully built reputation. Betrayal in this world was subtle and often invisible to outsiders. It did not always appear as open conflict or overt disloyalty. Instead, it manifested through whispers, small actions, or carefully timed omissions. Observing patterns, recognizing inconsistencies, and interpreting subtle cues became a daily necessity. Those who failed to notice the cracks in relationships quickly found themselves vulnerable. Gravano's survival depended not just on strength, but on perception. As his responsibilities grew, so did exposure to risk. Every assignment carried consequences that extended far beyond immediate outcomes. A poorly executed operation, a misjudged interaction, or a delayed decision could trigger cascading effects. Within the criminal hierarchy, the smallest mistake could ripple outward, affecting reputations, alliances, and even the stability of entire networks. Gravano operated with the knowledge that failure, though rare, was never without cost. Financial gain, a constant incentive, also carried risk. Money created visibility both for rivals and for law enforcement. The more successful an individual became, the more they attracted attention. Wealth in this context was never a guarantee of security, it was a measurement of vulnerability. Every asset, transaction, and business deal was subject to scrutiny, whether legal or informal. Each game required careful management to avoid exposure. Violence remained a controlled tool of influence and protection. Decisions to employ force were never taken lightly, as the consequences extended far beyond the immediate target. Each act communicated a message to others, both allies and adversaries, but also placed responsibility squarely on Gravano's shoulders. The knowledge that human life could be both a weapon and a liability intensified the psychological weight of his position. Psychologically, the environment shaped behavior, thought, and perception. Emotions were filtered, instincts suppressed, and moral reasoning reframed to prioritize survival and organizational goals. Natural human tendencies, empathy, spontaneity, and honesty became liabilities. Over time, the mental architecture required to function within this system fundamentally altered identity, creating a person simultaneously capable of rational decision-making and emotionally distant detachment. Law enforcement pressure remained constant, though often invisible. Investigators methodically built cases, tracking patterns, financial activity, and interpersonal dynamics. Their work required patience, persistence, and long-term strategy. Gravano, like many within the organization, may have believed in temporary immunity, but history repeatedly demonstrates that sustained scrutiny exposes even the most careful networks. Silence could protect for a while, but eventually the truth surfaced. Internal competition created additional stress. Ambition and fear quietly reshaped alliances, making relationships unpredictable. The same individuals once trusted implicitly could become rivals under the right circumstances. Gravano had to navigate these dynamics with constant attention, carefully balancing loyalty, influence, and perception. Every interaction became a strategic decision with potential ramifications far beyond the immediate moment. Family and personal relationships bore hidden costs. While financial support may have seemed generous, emotional connection deteriorated under the weight of secrecy and moral compromise. Loved ones sensed distance, tension, and inconsistency, even when unaware of the broader context. Over time, the emotional isolation that accompanies deep criminal involvement creates consequences as lasting and real as any legal penalty. Crossing moral and ethical lines had become normalized. What was once shocking now felt necessary. Survival, ambition, and loyalty provided justification for decisions that violated previous standards. Each act reinforced patterns, slowly reshaping Gravano's understanding of acceptable behavior. The danger of incremental compromise is that it builds momentum. What begins as a single act escalates into habitual conduct, and the threshold for moral deviation continues to rise. The duality of this existence, power and vulnerability, loyalty and risk, underscores a critical lesson about influence gained through secrecy and fear. Every reward carries an unseen cost, every decision carries hidden consequences, and every relationship is subject to the fragility of human nature. Gravano's story illustrates how even highly competent, disciplined individuals operate within systems that contain intrinsic instability. At this point, the combination of external scrutiny, internal tension, and moral compromise creates a unique psychological environment. Constant awareness of danger shapes thought processes, decision-making, and emotional responses. The perception of control is never complete, and every success is tempered by the knowledge that exposure or betrayal could negate years of effort. The human mind adapts to manage these pressures, but the cost is cumulative, often remaining invisible until a critical tipping point is reached. Communities surrounding organized crime experience indirect consequences. Businesses face extortion or coercion, opportunities for legitimate growth diminish, and fear infiltrates social and economic life. The hidden networks ripple outward, affecting innocent lives in ways that often go unrecognized. Understanding these broader effects highlights why the lessons of Gravano's life extend beyond individual choices to societal impact. The critical takeaway is that trust, once broken, has irreversible consequences. In any high-stakes system, criminal, corporate, or political relationships built on fear rather than mutual respect are fragile. Momentum gained through compromise and expediency eventually confronts reality. Gravano's journey demonstrates how a life structured on secrecy and conditional loyalty can achieve outward success, while remaining perpetually unstable. As Gravano's influence grew, so did his awareness of the consequences of each choice. Decisions once made casually now required strategic consideration, awareness of ripple effects, and anticipation of hidden responses. The world he had built for himself was powerful, yet inherently unstable, a paradox that would define the coming chapters of his life. Because in high-stakes environments, the greatest threat often comes not from external forces, but from the fragility of human relationships and the weight of every decision. And when trust falters, the illusion of control dissolves quickly and irreversibly. By the time Sammy Gravano reached the height of his influence, the environment around him had transformed into a complex web of opportunity, risk, loyalty, and fear. The streets he once knew as a boy had long since become arenas of strategy and calculation, where each step could have consequences that echoed far beyond the immediate moment. In this stage of life, decisions carried stakes that were both immediate and lasting, and Gravano's position required him to navigate these waters with precision and caution. Power had its own rhythm. Authority, influence, and respect were no longer abstract rewards. They had become tools for maintaining order and control within the organization. Yet with power came pressure, magnified by the knowledge that misjudgment could trigger cascading consequences. Every assignment, every meeting, every interaction was weighed not only for its outcome, but also for its impact on perception, trust, and stability. The margin for error was vanishingly small. The line between loyalty and survival was never clearer. Gravano understood that allegiance to the organization was both an asset and a liability. Compliance ensured protection, influence, and inclusion, but it also constrained freedom. Decisions could no longer be purely personal. They carried responsibility for the actions of others, and mistakes could imperil not only Gravano, but those connected to him. The moral and psychological weight of this reality shaped every choice. Financial success continued to reinforce the illusion of control. Money, while offering comfort and a tangible measure of achievement, was a double-edged sword. It drew attention, created expectations, and heightened scrutiny. Wealth in this context was never an escape from risk. It was a signal that one had reached a level of visibility that demanded constant vigilance. Each financial transaction carried potential exposure, and every accumulation of assets increased both status and vulnerability. Violence, long an instrument of strategy rather than impulse, now carried amplified consequence. Decisions regarding enforcement, retaliation, or demonstration of authority were carefully calculated, but no calculation could fully eliminate risk. The ethical and moral weight of these acts was cumulative, shaping Gravano's understanding of responsibility in ways that few outside the system could comprehend. Each act of violence left a mark, both on those affected and on Gravano himself. Psychologically, this stage demanded constant adaptation. Thought, emotion, and instinct were continually filtered through a lens of strategy and survival. Natural human impulses, empathy, honesty, spontaneity were subordinated to the needs of the organization. Moral reasoning became flexible, justifying actions that in ordinary life would be unthinkable. Over time, these adaptations created a mindset both highly functional within the system and deeply estranged from the outside world. Law enforcement pressure, though often invisible in daily life, continued building steadily. Investigators patiently tracked patterns, relationships, and financial activity, assembling cases methodically over months and years. Gravano, like others in the organization, may have believed himself untouchable, but the reality of methodical scrutiny was inevitable. Every act, no matter how carefully concealed, contributed to the eventual exposure of the network. Silence offered temporary protection, but was never a permanent shield. Internal dynamics had become increasingly fragile. Ambition, rivalry, and fear subtly shifted alliances. Individuals once trusted implicitly could become adversaries under the right circumstances. Gravano navigated this shifting landscape with keen awareness, measuring every interaction, evaluating every motive, and anticipating potential consequences. Strategy became not just a tool for action, but a framework for survival. Family and personal relationships continued to strain under the weight of secrecy. While financial provision might create appearances of care, emotional and psychological presence was limited by the demands of the organization. Loved ones perceived distance, tension, and inconsistency, even when unaware of the underlying factors. These invisible costs carried consequences as significant as any legal or operational threat. contributing to a life increasingly defined by isolation and compromise. The turning point, however, was not just about external pressures, it was about the choices Gravano made within the system. Crossing moral and ethical boundaries, once justified as necessary or minor, had become habitual. Action reinforced a pattern of compromise, gradually reshaping identity. The line between necessity and choice blurred. What once required deliberation now felt like standard procedure. This is the critical moment when survival becomes intertwined with complicity. The consequences of these decisions were not always immediate. Some unfolded over years, accumulating like hidden cracks in a foundation. Each act, each compromise, each failure to step back contributed to an invisible debt that would eventually demand repayment. This long-term consequence is a defining characteristic of high-stakes, clandestine systems. The true cost of participation often appears only after momentum has carried the individual too far to easily reverse course. Communities surrounding organized crime continued to feel the effects indirectly. Businesses faced pressure and coercion, legitimate opportunities diminished, and social cohesion eroded. Even those not directly involved experienced the tension, fear, and uncertainty generated by the hidden system. Gravano's decisions, while personal, had far-reaching consequences, demonstrating how individual actions in secretive systems can ripple outward into society. The psychological burden of navigating this stage cannot be overstated. Constant vigilance, moral negotiation, and strategic calculation create chronic stress. The mind becomes trained to anticipate threat in every interaction, every conversation, every environment. This constant pressure reshapes perception, decision-making, and emotional response. Even when success appears absolute, vulnerability remains a permanent companion. The broader lesson extends beyond criminal life. Any system that rewards short-term gain over integrity, that prioritizes obedience over ethics, and that elevates authority above accountability carries inherent risk. Decisions made under these conditions accumulate consequences that can persist far longer than immediate rewards. Gravano's story highlights the tension between perceived power and actual control, a lesson relevant in business, politics, and personal life. At this point, Gravano's life illustrates a paradox. The higher one rises within a clandestine, high-risk system, the more power one wields and the less freedom one truly has. Influence is inseparable from vulnerability. Success is inseparable from risk. And every decision carries a weight that extends beyond the individual. The illusion of invincibility, reinforced by careful management and outward success, obscures the fragility that defines the true nature of high-stakes environments. This stage demonstrates that survival depends on awareness, foresight, and adaptability. Each decision, ethical, strategic, or personal, shapes the trajectory of life in ways that compound over time. What appears as immediate advantage may become long-term liability, and what appears as loyalty may contain hidden obligation. Gravano's story emphasizes the importance of considering both the short-term and long-term consequences of every action, particularly when operating under conditions of secrecy and risk, because in the hidden world, every choice is a turning point. Every decision carries weight, and every moment has the potential to define a lifetime. By the time Sammy Gravano had navigated over a decade within the hidden structure of organized crime, the life he had built carried both power and peril. Influence, respect, and financial reward were undeniable, yet they existed alongside ever-present risk, moral compromise, and the growing weight of consequence. The illusion of invincibility that once reinforced confidence now began to waver, subtly at first, and then with undeniable force. Gravano's world, carefully constructed through loyalty, strategy, and silence, was approaching a point where exposure was inevitable. The system of trust and secrecy that had protected him for years was beginning to show cracks. Rivalries simmered quietly, jealousy moved behind polite facades, and alliances shifted imperceptibly. These subtle changes could easily be overlooked, yet in organized crime, the smallest miscalculation often leads to the most significant consequences. Gravano's keen perception and strategic thinking became crucial, but even the most attentive individuals cannot fully control the behavior of others. As responsibilities increased, Gravano recognized the true cost of influence. Every decision impacted not only his personal position, but the stability of the entire organization. Each assignment, whether financial, operational, or disciplinary, carried risk. The lines between necessity, choice, and moral compromise continued to blur. Acts once seen as tactical now became emblematic of the ethical erosion that had accumulated over years of immersion in this world. Financial gains, while impressive, became a double-edged sword. Wealth brought comfort and status, yet it also attracted attention from law enforcement, rival factions, and internal skeptics. Every transaction, investment, and business arrangement had to be carefully calculated. Money, while powerful, did not eliminate vulnerability, it amplified visibility. Gravano was acutely aware that the more he accumulated, the more precarious his position became. Violence, an instrument long utilized for control and enforcement, now carried amplified weight. The decisions to order, participate in, or condone acts of violence were never casual. Each act communicated a message, reinforced hierarchy, and demonstrated authority, yet it also expanded Gravano's exposure to moral, legal, and personal risk. Over time, the psychological impact of these decisions compounded, influencing perception, judgment, and identity. Psychologically, Gravano's environment demanded constant vigilance. Every interaction required assessment, every conversation evaluation, and every decision reflection. Natural impulses, empathy, honesty, or spontaneity remained suppressed. Moral reasoning was continually reframed to align with survival, loyalty, and efficiency. Over years, these adaptations solidified into a mindset capable of navigating extreme pressure, but increasingly estranged from conventional social and ethical norms. Law enforcement efforts, though historically patient, were now intensifying. Investigators had spent years analyzing relationships, finances, and patterns of behavior. The slow accumulation of evidence, once imperceptible, began forming a framework capable of exposing the full network. Gravano, despite his skill and awareness, could no longer assume immunity. The forces outside his control were moving steadily toward confrontation. Silence, strategy, and secrecy could delay the inevitable, but not prevent it. Internal tensions grew more pronounced. Ambition, fear, and rivalry had transformed relationships into strategic negotiations. Trusted allies might act unpredictably, alliances shifted quietly, and loyalty became conditional rather than absolute. Gravano's ability to anticipate these shifts determined survival, yet even the most accurate perception could not fully mitigate the risks inherent in a network built on fear and power. Family and personal relationships remained strained. Emotional distance, secrecy, and moral compromise created barriers that financial support could not bridge. Loved ones noticed tension, inconsistency, and subtle withdrawal, even if unaware of the underlying causes. These hidden consequences compounded the burden Gravano carried, adding layers of isolation to the already intense demands of operational responsibility. The turning point in Gravano's life emerged from the intersection of exposure, vulnerability, and accumulated consequence. What had once been an environment of calculated opportunity became one where the inevitability of detection, internal betrayal, or miscalculated decision-making loomed. The cumulative effect of moral compromise, operational risk, and human unpredictability created a situation where the consequences of past actions were converging on the present. At this stage, the illusion of control weakens. The systems and structures that provided protection begin to feel fragile. Decisions previously justified as tactical or necessary now carry the weight of potential irreversible consequences. Gravano's life demonstrates how engagement in high-stakes, clandestine systems creates an environment where every previous action, small or large, accumulates into a force that eventually demands resolution. Communities surrounding the organization continued to experience indirect but profound consequences. Fear, economic pressure, and the spread of influence altered social dynamics and limited opportunities. Even those outside direct involvement felt the ripple effects, emphasizing that criminal networks do not operate in isolation. Gravano's decisions, while personal, had systemic impact, demonstrating the far-reaching consequences of hidden structures of power. The broader lesson of this stage is critical. Systems built on secrecy, fear, and conditional loyalty are inherently unstable. Success gained through compromise, manipulation, or coercion carries an invisible debt. Exposure, whether legal, social, or relational, is inevitable. Gravano's story provides insight into the dynamics of high-risk, high-stakes environments, how momentum, loyalty, and moral compromise interact to create both opportunity and peril. At the same time, This period highlights the psychological reality of immersion in clandestine systems, continuous evaluation of risk, constant calculation, and suppression of instinctive morality create a mindset capable of survival, but increasingly alien to conventional social and ethical norms. Identity becomes intertwined with operational necessity, and the separation between personal values and organizational logic narrows. The culmination of these factors: exposure, vulnerability, moral erosion, and internal tension creates a moment of reckoning. Gravano's narrative illustrates that no amount of skill, influence, or financial success can fully shield an individual from the consequences of sustained engagement in morally and legally compromised systems. The structures that enable power also contain the seeds of collapse. Every decision made under these conditions becomes a pivot point. Every compromise strengthens both capability and vulnerability. Every act of loyalty contains embedded obligation. The weight of past actions accumulates, ultimately shaping the trajectory of life in ways that cannot be reversed. Gravano's experience demonstrates that high-stakes environments are defined as much by long-term consequences as by immediate action. The lesson for audiences is clear. Choices made in the shadows, even when appearing strategic or justified, carry lasting consequences. The illusion of control is temporary. Influence and success come at a cost, often unseen until exposure, internal fracture, or legal scrutiny demands reckoning. Gravano's story emphasizes the critical importance of foresight, integrity, and accountability in navigating any high-pressure, morally ambiguous system, because in the hidden world of organized crime, exposure is not a question of if but when, and the rising tide of consequences eventually reaches every decision. By the time Sammy Gravano reached the pivotal stage of his life within the organization, the pressures surrounding him had become nearly suffocating. Every move, every word, every action carried the potential to ignite consequences that could cascade far beyond the immediate moment. The combination of accumulated influence, internal tension, and law enforcement scrutiny had reached a threshold where even the most calculated decisions were fraught with uncertainty. Gravano's world, once navigable through skill and loyalty, had grown increasingly precarious. The weight of secrecy had begun to press on him in ways both subtle and overt. Decisions that were once tactical had transformed into moral quagmires. Every conversation had the potential to reveal hidden vulnerability. Every relationship carried embedded obligations, and every action was monitored not just by authority figures, but by peers, rivals, and allies whose ambitions were quietly shifting. Gravano had learned to read the subtlest cues, but even this skill could not fully remove the omnipresent tension. Paranoia, a natural byproduct of constant risk, became an unavoidable companion. The ability to trust others was limited, not because Gravano desired isolation, but because the environment demanded it. Friendships required verification, loyalties demanded proof, and even casual interactions had to be interpreted through the lens of potential threat. The human mind adapts to these conditions, creating heightened vigilance, rapid pattern recognition, and constant anticipation of danger, but it also fosters stress, emotional distance, and perpetual uncertainty. Financial power, which had once been a marker of achievement, now carried amplified exposure. Wealth, influence, and visibility made Gravano a target on multiple fronts. Law enforcement surveillance intensified, rivals watched for missteps, and internal scrutiny of ambition and performance never ceased. Each asset, each transaction, each movement became part of a larger network of observation, reminding him that advantage and vulnerability are inseparable in high-stakes systems. Violence, still a tool of enforcement and strategy, took on heavier psychological weight. Each decision to act or to direct others to act carried moral and operational consequences. The cumulative burden of past actions, combined with anticipation of future repercussions, created a constant tension between necessity and conscience. Gravano understood that survival depended on measured decisiveness, yet no calculation could eliminate the internal cost of repeated ethical compromise. Law enforcement pressure, long present but largely invisible, was now steadily converging. Investigators had spent years compiling financial records, mapping relationships, and observing behavioral patterns. What once appeared distant or manageable was approaching immediacy. Gravano's position, no matter how carefully cultivated, had become subject to forces outside his control. Silence, discretion, and strategy offered temporary shielding, but long-term exposure was inevitable. Internal organizational dynamics had grown increasingly volatile. Rivalries, subtle power shifts, and unspoken tensions required constant observation. Allies could become adversaries, trusted advisors might act unpredictably, and loyalty was continuously tested. Gravano had to navigate these dynamics while maintaining operational authority and protecting his own position, a task that required relentless attention, foresight, and psychological discipline. Family and personal life continued to bear invisible costs. Emotional distance, secrecy, and the weight of moral compromise created isolation that no financial compensation could alleviate. Loved ones noticed tension and inconsistency, even without understanding the underlying causes. This emotional strain compounded operational stress, adding layers of complexity to an already high-pressure existence. The accumulation of these pressures brought Gravano to a personal breaking point. The constant demand for vigilance, strategic foresight, and moral negotiation created a mental environment where mistakes could no longer be easily forgiven, either by others or by oneself. The stress of maintaining loyalty while avoiding exposure, balancing influence with risk, and navigating internal tension with external scrutiny began to exact a psychological toll. At this stage, Gravano's life illustrates the duality of survival and compromise. Decisions that once seemed purely strategic now carried ethical, legal, and relational weight. Choices that provided short-term advantage simultaneously increased long-term vulnerability. The balance between opportunity and risk, power and exposure, loyalty and self-preservation had narrowed to a razor's edge. One misstep could trigger cascading consequences. The communities affected by organized crime continued to experience indirect consequences. Businesses faced pressure, legitimate opportunities declined, and fear subtly infiltrated everyday life. The consequences of Gravano's decisions, though often invisible to outsiders, reverberated widely. This stage underscores the interconnectedness of hidden power networks and their broader societal impact. Psychologically, the environment demanded adaptation to extreme conditions. Constant threat anticipation, moral negotiation, and strategic calculation altered cognition, perception. Natural human instincts, empathy, honesty, spontaneity were subordinated to the imperatives of survival. Identity became intertwined with operational necessity, and personal morality adapted to align with organizational goals. Over time, these adaptations created both survival skills and long-lasting psychological burdens. The broader lesson embedded in this stage of Gravano's story is clear. Sustained engagement in high-risk, clandestine systems produces cumulative consequences. Decisions made under pressure, even when rationalized as necessary, accumulate into a complex web of vulnerability, exposure, and moral compromise. The illusion of control persists only until external forces or internal fracture confront it. Gravano's experience demonstrates how momentum, loyalty, and secrecy interact to shape both immediate outcomes and long-term destiny. At this breaking point, Gravano's life illustrates a central paradox. The higher one rises within a clandestine, high-stakes system, the more influence one holds, yet the less freedom one possesses. Every success brings increased visibility and responsibility. Every act of compliance reinforces dependency. Every choice reshapes identity. The path forward, while appearing to offer opportunity, simultaneously carries the seeds of exposure and consequence. This stage highlights an essential truth. Survival within such systems depends not only on skill, strategy, and loyalty, but also on recognition of cumulative risk. Every past decision contributes to present vulnerability. Every present decision shapes future outcomes. Gravano's story emphasizes the importance of foresight, integrity, and ethical reasoning, even when operating within morally ambiguous environments. Because in the world of hidden power, pressure accumulates quietly, paranoia becomes instinct, and the weight of secrets grows until it can no longer be carried lightly. And when the breaking point arrives, everything built on secrecy and fear is suddenly exposed to the reality it had long avoided. By the time Sammy Gravano reached the stage of life where exposure and pressure converged, the environment he had navigated for decades no longer felt controllable. The systems that had once provided influence, loyalty, and security were now revealing their fragility. Decisions that had been tactical now bore moral weight. Actions once justified by survival now carried the unmistakable signature of consequence. Gravano was beginning to understand the full cost of his choices, and the realization weighed heavier than any threat from outside forces. The illusion of invincibility began to crack. Years of strategic maneuvering, Careful alliances and calculated risks had built an image of dominance, but external pressures, law enforcement scrutiny, rival ambitions, and internal instability were converging in ways that no amount of planning could fully anticipate. Gravano understood that influence in a clandestine system is inherently fragile. Power can be gained quickly but lost even faster, and every advantage carries embedded vulnerability. Psychologically, this stage of life demanded constant negotiation between self-preservation and moral reality. Every decision had multiple dimensions: the immediate operational benefit, the perception within the network, the ethical implications, and the long-term exposure risk. The human mind, when engaged in high-stakes environments over extended periods, adapts in ways both functional and dangerous. Instincts for empathy, honesty, and open connection are suppressed. Fear, vigilance, and strategic calculation dominate thought. Over time, this creates a mindset capable of surviving extreme circumstances but increasingly estranged from normal social and ethical frameworks. Financial and operational power, while significant, now functioned as both shield and magnet. Wealth attracted attention from law enforcement investigators meticulously piecing together financial patterns. Influence drew both adoration and envy, while visibility created risk. Gravano had come to recognize that material and operational gains, while impressive, offered no absolute protection. The more successful he became, the more vulnerable he was. Success, in this context, is inseparable from exposure. Violence, long an instrument of control, now carried heightened consequence. Decisions to direct, participate in, or authorize acts of violence were never casual. Every move communicated authority but also magnified personal accountability. Gravano had experienced the operational necessity of such actions, yet the moral and psychological weight accumulated over decades. Each act, whether tactical or defensive, left an imprint on his conscience and shaped the perception of his identity within the organization. Internal pressures continued to escalate. Rivalries and ambitions silently undermined the stability of alliances. Individuals once trusted implicitly could become unpredictable under shifting circumstances. Gravano navigated these dynamics with constant vigilance, measuring tone and tension and action in ways that required both strategic foresight and psychological endurance. Every interaction became a decision point with cascading consequences. Family and personal relationships reflected the hidden cost of this world. Emotional distance, secrecy, and moral compromise created isolation that financial provision could not alleviate. Loved ones could perceive the tension, unpredictability, and withdrawal, but rarely understood the underlying reasons. The social and emotional costs of operating within clandestine systems often match or exceed operational risk, leaving scars that persist long after exposure or exit from the system. The realization of mortality and consequence began to crystallize. Gravano understood that exposure was not a hypothetical threat, it was imminent. Law enforcement investigations had accumulated critical mass, internal tension was approaching, volatility, and the fragile trust sustaining alliances was strained to its limit. The convergence of these factors created a moment where every past decision, every compromise, and every act of loyalty or miscalculation was poised to collide with reality. This turning point illustrates the paradox of high-stakes clandestine power. The closer one moves to the center of influence, the more apparent the limits of control become. Authority carries responsibility, visibility amplifies vulnerability, and loyalty depends on reciprocal behavior that may no longer exist. Gravano's experience underscores the reality that no system built on secrecy and conditional allegiance can remain stable indefinitely. Collapse may be gradual or sudden, but it is inevitable. Communities affected indirectly by Gravano's actions continued to feel consequences. Businesses faced coercion, legitimate opportunities declined, and fear subtly permeated everyday life. Even those outside direct engagement with the criminal network experienced the ripple effects. The lessons extend beyond organized crime. Every clandestine system, no matter how disciplined, carries hidden costs that ripple outward into society, shaping the lives of many beyond the immediate participants. At this stage, Gravano's choices became intensely consequential. Decisions once taken casually now required profound consideration. The accumulation of past compromises, operational risks, and moral concessions created an environment where momentum carried weight that could no longer be ignored. Every action shaped the immediate future and had the potential to alter the trajectory of a lifetime. Psychologically, Living under these conditions reinforces hypervigilance, strategic calculation, and moral negotiation. The mind becomes trained to anticipate threat in every scenario, interpret subtle cues as potential indicators of risk, and suppress natural human impulses that might endanger survival. This adaptation allows functional performance but leaves long-term emotional and ethical consequences, including estrangement from conventional social norms and persistent psychological strain. The broader lesson is clear. Engagement in high-risk, morally ambiguous systems produces cumulative consequences. Momentum gained through strategic compromise eventually converges with exposure and accountability. Gravano's life demonstrates how operational success in clandestine environments is inseparable from risk, moral erosion, and the inevitability of consequence. Understanding this dynamic is critical for anyone navigating complex systems, criminal, corporate, or political. This period of Gravano's life also highlights the delicate balance between influence and vulnerability. Power is inseparable from responsibility, and success is inseparable from scrutiny. Every advantage contains an embedded risk. Every act of loyalty carries conditional obligation. The higher one rises, the narrower the margin for error, and the more permanent the consequences of misjudgment. Gravano's experience provides a case study in the interplay between opportunity, risk, and accountability in environments where secrecy and loyalty govern behavior. Because in high-stakes systems, every past choice accumulates, every present action carries amplified consequence, and every moment offers the potential to alter the course of a life forever. And when the turning tide arrives, even the most carefully constructed walls of secrecy and influence can no longer contain the rising consequences. By the time Sammy Gravano reached the precipice of his life's most critical decisions, the environment around him had transformed from one of controlled influence to an arena of fragile alliances, mounting exposure and relentless pressure. Every move he had made, every compromise he had accepted, and every act of loyalty had created an intricate web of consequence that now converged toward a single reality. The higher he had risen, the less room there was for error. The systems that had once protected him were showing their limits, and Gravano could no longer rely solely on skill, cunning, or discretion to navigate them. The psychological burden of survival had become nearly constant. Years of operating in a clandestine system shaped not only Gravano's behavior but also his perception of risk, trust, and morality. Natural instincts, empathy, spontaneity, honesty were suppressed in favor of vigilance, strategic calculation, and moral flexibility. The mind, trained to survive under perpetual threat, functioned with remarkable efficiency in high-stakes decision-making, but carried a hidden cost: emotional isolation and a growing estrangement from conventional ethical frameworks. Trust, always conditional in organized crime, was now under extreme strain. Those Gravano once relied upon implicitly, associates, allies, even family members, were subject to the shifting dynamics of ambition, fear, and secrecy. Decisions made months or years earlier, once seemingly justified, were being reassessed under the pressures of exposure and internal tension. Gravano had to navigate these shifting sands while maintaining authority, protecting his position, and anticipating consequences that extended far beyond the immediate moment. Financial influence, while significant, had begun to amplify risk rather than reduce it. Accumulated wealth brought both visibility and scrutiny. Law enforcement investigators meticulously tracked transactions, patterns, and connections. Rival factions monitored resources, movements, and alliances. Every dollar, every property, every business arrangement was no longer just a measure of success, it was a potential vulnerability. Gravano had to weigh every financial decision for operational necessity, perception, and long-term security. Violence, long a strategic instrument, now carried both operational and psychological weight. Orders, participation, and sanctioning of acts of force were careful, calculated, yet each action left an imprint on Gravano's conscience, on his identity, and on the perception of power within the network. The repeated requirement to exercise lethal authority reinforced the functional hierarchy, but simultaneously deepened moral erosion. Even those trained to navigate such environments feel the invisible burden of repeated compromise, and Gravano was no exception. Law enforcement pressure, patient and methodical for years, was now approaching a point of acceleration. Investigators had spent decades mapping relationships, monitoring finances, and building cases. The seemingly invisible threads of surveillance, once background noise, were coalescing into an actionable framework. Gravano could no longer rely solely on discretion or loyalty to shield himself. Exposure, once theoretical, had become a tangible, imminent reality. Internal organizational dynamics were equally volatile. Rivalries, subtle ambition, and conditional loyalty created a landscape where alliances could shift in an instant. Trusted associates might act unpredictably, motivated by fear, self-interest, or misperception. Gravano's survival depended on constant observation, nuanced interpretation of human behavior, and rapid adaptation to evolving circumstances. Every conversation, every gesture, and every decision now carried strategic significance. Family and personal life reflected the hidden cost of this existence. Emotional distance, secrecy, and ethical compromise had created isolation that no financial provision could repair. Loved ones perceived tension, inconsistency, and withdrawal, often without understanding the underlying reasons. This emotional burden compounded operational stress, leaving Gravano to navigate both external threat and internal conflict simultaneously. As pressure intensified, Gravano faced the stark reality of moral and practical limits. The compromises that had once felt tactical were now the foundation of a system that demanded further concession. The longer he had participated, the more entrenched the network became, and the harder it was to extricate himself without severe consequence. Survival required balancing operational necessity, ethical awareness, and psychological resilience, a balance that became increasingly precarious. Communities surrounding organized crime felt the indirect but profound impact of Gravano's actions. Local businesses faced coercion or intimidation, legitimate economic opportunity declined, and social cohesion eroded. Even those outside the direct sphere of influence were affected, illustrating the broader societal consequences of clandestine networks. Gravano's decisions, while personal, rippled outward, highlighting the interconnectedness of high-stakes systems. The edge of collapse emerges not in sudden moments but as the accumulation of pressure, exposure, and compromised choice. Each past decision, each act of loyalty or betrayal, each moment of moral compromise created momentum. That momentum now converged on a singular reality. Gravano could no longer operate in isolation from consequence. The systems that once provided protection were strained, the alliances that once ensured loyalty were fragile, and the legal scrutiny once distant had reached a critical threshold. The psychological toll at this stage is profound. Constant vigilance, strategic foresight, and moral negotiation create cognitive and emotional strain. Hyper-awareness becomes second nature. Paranoia is adaptive, and instinctual responses are overridden by survival strategy. Even those with extraordinary skill and discipline experience mounting stress as the weight of history, exposure, and potential collapse coalesces. Gravano's mental resilience, while remarkable, was tested as never before. The broader lesson of this chapter extends beyond crime. Any high-pressure system that rewards immediate gain at the expense of ethical consistency or long-term foresight carries cumulative risk. Momentum gained through strategic compromise eventually converges with exposure, accountability, and human unpredictability. Gravano's story illustrates how sustained engagement in such systems shapes both opportunity and vulnerability, and why ethical foresight remains essential even in environments dominated by secrecy and risk. At this stage, Gravano's life demonstrates a central paradox. The higher one rises within a clandestine system, the more influence one wields, yet the less freedom one possesses. Every success brings visibility and responsibility. Every act of compliance reinforces dependency. Every choice contributes to the cumulative weight of consequence. The moment on the edge of collapse reveals that momentum, risk, and ethical compromise eventually demand resolution, whether through exposure, realignment, or surrender. Because in the hidden world, the pressure accumulates quietly, the risks compound invisibly, and the cost of survival is measured not just in success, but in the weight of every past decision. And when the edge of collapse is reached, there is no turning back, only a confrontation with the full consequences of a life lived in shadows. By the time Sammy Gravano reached this pivotal phase of his life, the cumulative weight of years of decisions, compromises, and moral concessions had begun to demand attention. The world he had navigated with such precision, built on loyalty, secrecy, and calculated risk, was now showing cracks that could no longer be ignored. Gravano had risen to a level of influence that few could imagine, yet the very systems that had elevated him now carried the seeds of exposure and potential collapse. The line between survival and self-destruction had become painfully thin, and the decisions he faced were no longer tactical, they were existential. The psychological burden of years in a clandestine, high-risk environment was immense. Gravano had long suppressed natural instincts toward empathy, honesty, and spontaneous human connection in favor of vigilance, calculation, and strategic foresight. Every decision, every interaction, every seemingly minor choice had accumulated into a dense web of consequence. By this point, the mental weight of operating under constant threat, combined with the moral compromises required to survive, had created a near-constant state of tension and internal reckoning. Trust, already conditional in organized crime, had become increasingly fragile. Long-standing alliances were strained under the weight of ambition, fear, and exposure. Colleagues who had once been loyal partners could now be unpredictable, and rivalries simmered quietly beneath the surface. Gravano had learned to read subtle behavioral cues, but even the most finely tuned perception could not fully eliminate the risk of betrayal or misjudgment. In this world, vigilance was constant, and any lapse could carry irreversible consequences. Financial power, while significant, no longer served as a shield. Wealth and influence had long made Gravano a figure of prominence within the network, but visibility also attracted scrutiny from law enforcement, rival factions, and internal observers alike. Each dollar, each investment, and each transaction carried potential exposure. Gravano understood that success had increased his vulnerability. The more he had accumulated, the more he had to protect, and the more attractive he had become as a target. Violence, a long-standing tool of control, now carried both operational and existential significance. The decisions to employ force were no longer simply tactical, they were symbolic, carrying implicit consequences for reputation, authority, and personal liability. Each act of violence left an indelible mark, shaping the perception of Gravano's power while simultaneously increasing legal and moral exposure. The psychological impact of these repeated acts, combined with the anticipation of future obligations, contributed to an internal reckoning that could no longer be postponed. Law enforcement scrutiny, patient and methodical for years, was reaching a tipping point. Investigators had spent decades compiling financial records, tracking patterns of behavior, and mapping relationships. The web of observation that had been slowly growing was now approaching critical mass. No longer could Gravano assume that discretion or loyalty alone would suffice. Exposure was no longer hypothetical, it was imminent. The forces outside his control were converging toward a confrontation that would define the next stage of his life. Internal organizational dynamics were equally unstable. Ambition, fear, and conditional loyalty created an environment where alliances could shift suddenly. Trusted associates might act unpredictably, motivated by self-interest or perception of opportunity. Gravano had to balance operational authority with careful attention to interpersonal dynamics, constantly monitoring for subtle changes that could indicate a shift in loyalty or the emergence of a threat. Every interaction carried weight, and every choice had the potential to trigger cascading consequences. Family and personal relationships reflected the hidden costs of this life. Emotional distance, secrecy, and moral compromise had created isolation that financial compensation could not repair. Loved ones could sense tension and withdrawal, but often remained unaware of the deeper stakes. Gravano faced the dual burden of managing high-stakes operational decisions while navigating the fractured emotional landscape of a personal life constrained by the demands of secrecy and survival. The turning point of this stage was moral and existential. Years of incremental compromises had created a life in which tactical decisions were inseparable from ethical consequence. What began as survival-based necessity had become habitual, and Gravano was now forced to confront the totality of his actions. Each choice had contributed to a momentum that now demanded reckoning. The cumulative effect of secrecy, moral compromise, and high-stakes decision-making had created a convergence that could no longer be ignored. Communities affected indirectly by Gravano's actions continued to experience the ripple effects. Local businesses were pressured, legitimate economic opportunities were constrained, and social cohesion was eroded by fear and uncertainty. Even those outside the immediate network of influence felt the consequences. Gravano's life, while personal and insular in appearance, was connected to a wider societal impact, a reminder that clandestine networks affect far more than just the individuals directly involved. The psychological cost at this stage was profound. The mind had been conditioned to anticipate risk, to interpret subtle cues as indicators of threat, and to suppress instinctive morality in favor of strategic survival. While these adaptations ensured functional performance under extreme conditions, they also created lasting consequences: emotional isolation, moral compromise, and a profound sense of disconnection from conventional social and ethical frameworks. Gravano's ability to operate effectively within that environment came at a personal cost that was both invisible and enduring. The broader lesson of this chapter is clear. Sustained engagement in high-risk, morally ambiguous systems produces cumulative consequences. Momentum gained through strategic compromise eventually converges with exposure, accountability, and human unpredictability. Gravano's story demonstrates that operational success in clandestine systems is inseparable from risk, moral erosion, and the inevitability of consequence. Understanding these dynamics is essential for anyone navigating complex systems, whether in crime, business, or politics. At this stage, Gravano's life illustrates a paradox. The higher one rises within a high-stakes system, the more influence one wields, yet the less freedom one possesses. Success brings visibility and responsibility. Loyalty reinforces dependence. Choices made in secrecy accumulate into long-term consequence. Momentum, risk, and ethical compromise converge, demanding a resolution that is both personal and systemic. Gravano's journey underscores the reality that no clandestine system remains stable indefinitely, and that reckoning personal, legal, and ethical is inevitable. Because in the hidden world, the full weight of every decision eventually demands confrontation. Every choice carries consequence, and every life built in secrecy must ultimately face the light. And when reckoning arrives, there is no escaping the cost of survival, the accumulation of compromise, or the consequences of a life lived on the edge of morality. By the time Sammy Gravano had reached the stage of his life defined by exposure and accountability, the environment around him had shifted from controlled influence to an unstable system of fragile alliances, mounting threats, and unrelenting pressure. The network he had spent decades navigating, built on loyalty, secrecy, and strategic calculation, was beginning to unravel under its own weight. Gravano's position of power, once a source of confidence, had become a crucible of risk, moral compromise, and potential collapse. The psychological burden of his accumulated experiences was enormous. Years of operating in a clandestine, high-stakes environment had forced the suppression of natural human instincts, empathy, spontaneity, and honesty in favor of vigilance, calculation, and strategic forethought. Each choice, each interaction, and each seemingly minor decision contributed to a web of consequence that had grown dense and inescapable. Gravano's mental acuity remained sharp, but the cost was emotional and ethical strain that could no longer be ignored. Trust, always conditional in organized crime, had reached a critical point. Alliances once dependable were now tenuous, shaped by ambition, fear, and self-interest. Colleagues and associates who had been loyal partners could act unpredictably, and the subtle shifts in loyalty could have catastrophic consequences. Gravano's ability to interpret behavior and anticipate risk was essential for survival, yet no amount of skill could fully mitigate the unpredictability of human nature under pressure. Financial influence, while substantial, now amplified exposure rather than provided protection. Wealth, accumulated through years of careful maneuvering, had attracted the scrutiny of law enforcement, rival factions, and internal observers. Each transaction, each property acquisition, and each investment was a potential vulnerability. Gravano understood that his success made him a target. The higher he rose, the more conspicuous he became, and the more dangerous his position. Violence, a long-used tool of control and influence, now carried profound consequences. Every decision to employ force, whether as punishment, intimidation, or strategic enforcement, left lasting marks on both Gravano's psyche and the perception of his authority. These actions reinforced his position, but they also expanded his moral and legal exposure. The accumulation of repeated acts of violence contributed to the tension between operational necessity and personal conscience, creating internal conflict that intensified with each passing year. Law enforcement pressure, methodical and long-term, was reaching an irreversible point. Investigators had spent decades constructing a framework of evidence, financial records, communications, surveillance, and human intelligence. What once seemed distant and manageable now loomed as imminent. Gravano could no longer rely solely on discretion or loyalty to protect him. Exposure was no longer a matter of if but when. The convergence of legal scrutiny, operational pressure, and internal tension created a crucible that demanded careful navigation. Internal dynamics within the organization had grown increasingly volatile. Ambition, fear, and conditional loyalty shaped a constantly shifting environment. Trusted associates could become adversaries overnight, while rivals maneuvered to exploit weaknesses. Gravano had to balance operational control with careful observation, anticipating both the intentions of others and the consequences of his own actions. Every interaction carried weight, and every decision could trigger a cascade of effects with far-reaching implications. Family and personal relationships were strained under the weight of secrecy and moral compromise. Emotional distance, combined with the constant demand for vigilance, created isolation that no financial provision could repair. Loved ones perceived tension, withdrawal, and inconsistency, often without understanding the full scope of the circumstances. The personal cost of Gravano's lifestyle was cumulative, compounding the operational, legal, and moral pressures he faced daily. The realization of inevitable collapse became unavoidable. Years of accumulated compromises, moral concessions, and strategic decisions had created momentum that was now converging on a point of reckoning. What had once been a controlled, tactical environment had evolved into a high-risk situation where exposure, betrayal, and legal consequences could no longer be delayed. Gravano's decisions in the coming months would determine not just his survival, but the trajectory of his life beyond the organization. Communities surrounding Gravano's network continued to experience indirect effects. Businesses were pressured, economic opportunity was limited, and social cohesion eroded under the constant influence of fear and uncertainty. Even those outside direct involvement were affected, illustrating the broader societal impact of clandestine networks. Gravano's personal choices had rippling consequences far beyond his immediate circle, underscoring the systemic effects of hidden power. Psychologically, the environment demanded constant hypervigilance, strategic foresight, and moral negotiation. Gravano's mind had adapted to anticipate risk in every scenario, interpret subtle behavioral cues as indicators of threat, and suppress instinctive morality in favor of survival and operational efficiency. These adaptations allowed him to function effectively under extreme pressure, but at the cost of emotional isolation, moral erosion, and long-term psychological strain. The broader lesson of this stage is universal. Sustained engagement in high-pressure, morally ambiguous systems produces cumulative consequences. Momentum gained through strategic compromise eventually collides with exposure, accountability, and human unpredictability. Gravano's story demonstrates that operational success in clandestine environments is inseparable from risk, moral compromise, and the inevitability of consequence. Awareness of these dynamics is crucial for anyone navigating complex systems, whether criminal, corporate, or political. At this stage, Gravano's life exemplifies a fundamental paradox. The higher one rises within a high-stakes, clandestine system, the more influence one wields, yet the less freedom one possesses. Every success brings visibility and responsibility. Every act of compliance reinforces dependency. Every choice contributes to the cumulative weight of consequence. Momentum, risk, and ethical compromise converge, creating a reality where survival, reputation, and morality are constantly in tension. Because in hidden systems of power, the cost of influence is constant vigilance. The weight of decisions accumulates invisibly, and the path to collapse is paved by the consequences of choices made over a lifetime. When the tide of exposure rises, and the systems of loyalty and secrecy can no longer hold, every action, every compromise, and every decision is measured against its inevitable consequences. By the time Sammy Gravano reached this stage, the environment he had carefully navigated for decades had shifted from one of controlled influence to an inescapable web of exposure, betrayal, and escalating consequences. The network he had helped sustain, built on loyalty, fear, and strategic maneuvering, was unraveling under both internal and external pressure. Gravano, once at the apex of operational authority, now faced the reality that no skill, cunning, or influence could fully insulate him from the consequences of his accumulated decisions. The psychological toll of this phase was immense. Years of operating in secrecy, making strategic compromises, and suppressing natural instincts had created a mindset capable of extraordinary calculation, Yet it carried hidden costs. Empathy, trust, and moral instinct had long been subordinated to survival and strategic advantage. The cumulative effect was a life where vigilance was constant, emotional distance was necessary, and every interaction carried weighty implications. Gravano's mental resilience, while remarkable, was being tested as never before. Trust, always conditional in organized crime, had now reached its breaking point. Alliances that once seemed dependable were strained under the pressures of exposure and internal competition. Colleagues, long-standing allies, and even family members became sources of uncertainty. Gravano learned that even loyalty rooted in years of shared experience could shift under fear, self-interest, or opportunity. Every interaction required careful interpretation, and every decision could trigger a cascade of consequences. Financial power, while impressive, now amplified vulnerability. Wealth, accumulated over decades, drew the attention of law enforcement investigators meticulously building a case. Every transaction, property, and business investment became a potential entry point for scrutiny. Rival factions observed opportunities to exploit, while internal associates weighed loyalty against personal gain. Gravano had to navigate a world in which success itself had become a form of exposure. Violence, once a tool of control and influence, now carried heightened moral and practical significance. Decisions to act, order, or authorize force had consequences that extended far beyond immediate tactical gains. Each act reinforced authority but simultaneously increased legal and ethical exposure. The psychological weight of repeated violence, combined with the anticipation of future obligations, created a sense of moral accumulation that Gravano could no longer ignore. Law enforcement pressure had reached an irreversible stage. Investigators had spent years compiling evidence, financial records, human testimony, and surveillance, creating a framework capable of dismantling entire networks. Exposure was no longer a distant threat. It was imminent. Gravano could no longer rely solely on discretion, secrecy, or loyalty to protect him. The systems he had depended upon for survival were strained to their limits, and collapse was no longer hypothetical. Internal organizational dynamics contributed further instability. Ambition, fear, and conditional loyalty created a volatile environment where trusted associates might suddenly act unpredictably. Gravano had to constantly assess human behavior, interpret subtle signals, and anticipate consequences. Every decision, every conversation, and every gesture now carried amplified risk. The interplay of operational authority and personal vulnerability was inescapable. Family and personal relationships bore the hidden consequences of this life. Emotional distance, secrecy, and moral compromise created isolation that financial provision could not repair. Loved ones noticed tension, unpredictability, and withdrawal, often without understanding the underlying pressures. The personal cost of Gravano's choices compounded the operational, legal, and ethical burdens he faced daily. The critical moment of this chapter was defined by betrayal and exposure. Long-standing alliances fractured under pressure, while law enforcement investigations approached completion. Decisions made decades earlier, once justified as tactical necessities, were now subjects of scrutiny and consequence. Gravano's operational success had created momentum, but that same momentum now carried him toward inevitable confrontation with the consequences of a lifetime spent navigating secrecy, power, and moral compromise. Communities surrounding Gravano's network continued to feel indirect effects. Businesses faced coercion, legitimate economic opportunities were constrained, and social cohesion eroded under the influence of fear and uncertainty. Even those outside direct involvement were affected, highlighting the systemic impact of clandestine networks. Gravano's personal choices, while often private, had far-reaching societal consequences. Psychologically, the environment demanded constant hypervigilance, strategic calculation, and moral negotiation. Gravano's mind had adapted to anticipate threat in every scenario, interpret subtle cues, and suppress instinctive morality in favor of operational efficiency. These adaptations allowed functional performance under extreme pressure, but at the cost of emotional isolation, moral erosion, and lasting psychological strain. The broader lesson of this chapter is clear. Engagement in high-stakes, morally ambiguous systems produces cumulative consequences. Momentum gained through strategic compromise eventually collides with exposure, accountability, and human unpredictability. Gravano's story demonstrates that operational success in clandestine environments is inseparable from risk, moral compromise, and the inevitability of consequence. Awareness of these dynamics is essential for anyone navigating complex systems, whether in crime, business, or politics. This phase of Gravano's life exemplifies a profound paradox. The higher one rises within a clandestine system, the more influence one wields, yet the less freedom one possesses. Success brings visibility and responsibility. Loyalty reinforces dependence. Choices accumulate into long-term consequences that cannot be avoided. The moment of collapse highlights the tension between operational authority and personal vulnerability, a tension that defines the lives of those who navigate clandestine networks. Because in the world of hidden power, success and exposure are inseparable. Loyalty and betrayal are intertwined, and every action carries consequences that cannot be undone. And when the fall occurs, the systems of secrecy, influence, and fear can no longer contain the consequences of decades of choices. By the time Sammy Gravano reached the final chapter of his journey through the hidden corridors of organized crime, he found himself confronting the full weight of decades of choices, compromises, and consequences. The world that had once provided influence, loyalty, and financial reward had become a place of exposure, fragility, and moral reckoning. What had been a life of careful calculation, strategic alliances, and operational dominance was now a life of reflection and opportunity to examine not only the events themselves but also their meaning, impact, and lessons for anyone willing to observe. Psychological and emotional consequences of his life were undeniable. Years of operating in secrecy, managing threats, and navigating morally ambiguous circumstances had demanded constant vigilance and calculation. Natural instincts, empathy, trust, honesty were subordinated to survival, strategy, and operational efficiency. Gravano's mind had adapted to the constant pressures of high-stakes decision-making, but the cost had been cumulative emotional isolation, moral erosion, and a persistent tension between identity and behavior. At the same time, the consequences of his choices were now fully visible. Law enforcement pressure had achieved tangible results. The carefully constructed network of alliances, influence, and secrecy had been disrupted. Betrayals and shifting loyalties, once quietly managed, had emerged as pivotal factors that shaped the final outcome. Gravano was forced to confront the reality that decades of tactical success were inseparable from the vulnerability they produced. Power, visibility, and influence all carried embedded risk, and no skill or foresight could entirely eliminate that risk. Financial success, which had once been a marker of achievement and control, now highlighted the paradox of visibility and exposure. Every asset, investment, and transaction had contributed to Gravano's influence, yet each had also left a trail that investigators and rivals could follow. Wealth, influence, and reputation had amplified vulnerability in ways that could no longer be mitigated. The very tools that allowed him to succeed had also sown the seeds of collapse. The psychological reality of sustained high-stakes engagement became a central theme of Gravano's reflection. Constant evaluation of risk, suppression of natural human impulses, and moral compromise shaped both perception and identity. Hypervigilance, strategic calculation, and ethical negotiation became habitual, ensuring survival but leaving lasting consequences. Emotional and ethical recalibration became necessary once the operational imperatives ended, yet the psychological imprint of decades of secrecy, threat, and calculation remained indelible. Family and personal relationships revealed another layer of consequence. Emotional distance, secrecy, and moral compromise had created profound isolation. Loved ones, while perhaps unaware of specific events, had experienced the tension, withdrawal, and unpredictability inherent in Gravano's life. These consequences underscored a central truth: operational and strategic success in morally ambiguous systems carries hidden social and emotional costs that are often invisible until exposure or reflection forces recognition. The broader societal implications of Gravano's life became increasingly clear as he examined his legacy. Communities had been affected indirectly by the operations, coercion, and influence of his network. Businesses had faced pressure, legitimate opportunities had diminished, and social trust had eroded. Even those not directly involved had been touched by the consequences of clandestine power. Gravano's experience demonstrated that individual choices in high-stakes systems extend far beyond personal outcomes. creating ripple effects across entire communities. At the heart of this stage was the realization that no clandestine system is immune to the cumulative weight of decisions, compromise, and human unpredictability. Momentum gained through tactical advantage eventually converges with exposure, accountability, and consequence. Gravano's life illustrated that survival, influence, and success in such environments are inseparable from the risks they create. The story of his rise and fall serves as both a cautionary tale and a source of insight for anyone navigating complex systems. Reflecting on the moral dimension of his experience, Gravano recognized the inevitability of compromise and its consequences. Every act of loyalty, every decision to prioritize survival over principle, every engagement in morally ambiguous behavior had contributed to a life of accumulated consequence. Understanding the relationship between choice, consequence, and ethical integrity became central to his reflection. The lesson was clear: long-term stability and fulfillment cannot exist in systems where compromise and secrecy dominate. The final stage of Gravano's journey also emphasizes resilience and foresight. While operational environments may demand moral flexibility in the short term, individuals must ultimately reconcile with the ethical, legal, and personal consequences of their actions. Strategic decision-making, while necessary, is incomplete without an awareness of long-term impact. Gravano's story demonstrates that the measure of success is not simply influence, wealth, or operational achievement. It is the capacity to understand and navigate the consequences of one's choices over a lifetime. In this stage, Gravano also confronted the paradox of power and freedom. The higher one rises in clandestine networks, the more visibility and influence one attains, but the less freedom one truly has. Decisions are never isolated, loyalty is never unconditional, and every action carries embedded risk. The accumulation of operational responsibility, moral compromise, and human unpredictability creates a landscape in which survival is inseparable from consequence. Gravano's reflections highlight the complexity of navigating systems built on secrecy, fear, and conditional trust. The story concludes with a strong lesson: choices made under pressure, secrecy, or moral ambiguity always carry consequences, both visible and hidden. Influence, success, and authority may provide temporary advantage, but they cannot shield individuals from the accumulation of risk, exposure, and ethical responsibility. Gravano's life demonstrates that awareness, foresight, and ethical reflection are essential tools for navigating any complex, high-stakes system. As Gravano reflects, the ultimate insight is one of balance and accountability. Survival in high-pressure, clandestine environments depends not only on skill and strategy, but on an understanding of the long-term impact of decisions. Influence and power carry embedded risks. Ethical compromise carries hidden costs. And momentum gained through strategic action always converges with exposure and consequence. The story of his life is both a warning and a lesson. The paths of secrecy, power, and moral compromise lead inevitably to confrontation with the consequences they create. Because in the hidden world, every decision matters, every compromise accumulates, and the shadow of consequence eventually reaches every corner of a life lived in secrecy. The final lesson is clear: integrity, foresight, and accountability are not just moral ideals, they are the foundation for long-term stability, personal reflection, and meaningful impact. Gravano's story, told in full, provides a cautionary tale for anyone tempted by influence built on secrecy, fear, or moral compromise, while also offering insight into human behavior, resilience, and the costs of power. In the end, a life in the shadows cannot escape the light of reflection, and the choices made along the way define not only survival, but the measure of legacy, conscience, and wisdom.